let's move on now to an even harder topic to discuss, because I think the trends are even harder to follow and the data is even more complex, which is mass shootings, right? Mass shootings by the Violence Project definition, which is derived from a Congressional Research Service report that came out in 2015. But that's, this is the one I find most reliable. We can discuss a little bit the different definitions that exist and the pros and cons of each of them. But under this definition, which is 4 more people killed in a single incident in public for reasons that aren't related to gang violence or other criminal activity, there has not been so far this year a single incident of that type in the United States. And then if you go to some of the other definitions, the expanded ones, if you look at just 4 more people killed in an incident, this is actually the most common of the sort of mass shooting where you're measuring by how many people have been actually murdered. That's down. I think there's been 9. Basically, these are usually when someone sadly murders their family in their home. Much more common than people, I think, realize. That doesn't get the sort of media coverage. This is another reason why I think the first definition is good, because that's what, when people think of mass shootings and you think of media coverage, and this is what those types of shootings are, what actually gets covered in national media. They might use a different count. They might use the broader count, the gun violence archive count. A lot of media outlets will use that, but they actually cover the shootings that show up in the Violence Project's definition. But regardless, the 4 more people killed, the sort of family side that you see, that's down from 15 to 9, according to Professor James Allen Fox so far this year. And then even the gun violence archive definition, which is just 4 more people injured in any sort of incident, could be gang related or what have you. That's fallen as well. That's down about 30% as of today. We're April 19th here. And just to be clear, because these things will change most certainly. And I guess I'm just wondering what, if anything, do you make of that? Especially the absence of those higher profile type events. Do you think that tells us anything about where we might end up by the end of the year?
I don't love the other definitions, and I know we can talk about methodological issues, but I'm just thinking that there was a shooting on last week here in New Orleans. 11 people were shot outside of a nightclub. 1 was killed. That doesn't count as a mass shooting in the definition of the Violence Project. So, right. But like 11 people shot.
Or the Kansas City Super Bowl parade would also not fall into the Violence Project definition. Exactly.
So if you're ignoring that, and I think by the Violence Project definition, there's never been a mass shooting in New Orleans.
Right.
Which
I'm not positive, but that could be the case.
I tend to remember having checked. And so it I think raises questions about the validity of any findings if the definition is so strict. I like the gun violence archive definition. I like how accessible it is. And I like that how it just 4 more people shot. It's a very,
doesn't that have the opposite problem?
It does a little bit. But what we saw, I mean, part of the problem with that definition is that it's like as shootings go up, mass shootings go up.
Right. Actually, that's one interesting thing. So just to zero in on, let's just talk about the gun violence archive real quick. Because I think what you said there would be logical, right? That because the gun violence archive definition just captures a lot more shootings generally, and they're shootings that look more like your what's typical kind of gun violence in the United States. You would expect that it would fluctuate with the murder rate, right? But it hasn't really, and that's kind of odd. Like last year, the mass shooting count from Gun Violence Archive was actually up slightly from the previous year.
Yeah, I wrote about that what you saw in the Gun Violence Archive data was that just like in with regular shootings, mass shootings skyrocketed in 2020 and we're up in 2021. And then what we saw in 2022 and 2023 is that shootings fell in the gun violence archive data. Shooting victims fell, as they should have, given that murder fell, but mass shootings didn't. And so you went from like 4% of all shooting victims were shot in a mass shooting in 2019 to a rising percent that was 6.5% in 2023. That seems to be reversing. And so I think it's interesting that we are finally starting to see a decline in mass shootings that's equally large relative to the overall decline in all other shootings. The mass shooting decline was almost 40% through February-ish. So it has come down a little bit, but still substantially fewer mass shootings this year than in previous years.
Yeah. Under that, it is interesting, right? I mean, I guess this gets to the core of why it's hard to talk about mass shootings, because like, what is your goal? What are you trying to measure? Right. That's why I think I prefer the Violence Project definition, because what I want to see are these types of high spectacle shootings that people associate with that term. And I think that something like street crime mass shootings are a different issue. Like, it's a different problem. This is also why I don't think that the fact we haven't had any mass shootings on the Violence Project definition doesn't really tell us much about whether we're going to have a lot this year or not, because they're pretty sporadic. There's not really a trend line if you look back through when these things occur throughout the last 20 years or so. For instance, 2022, there wasn't a mass shooting under the Violence Project definition until May. Until the middle of May. And then there were three in a pretty short period of time. And you ended up with, I believe, 7 that year, which is about another remarkable thing I think we could get into. But since 2017, you've had between 7 and 9 Violence Project mass shootings since each year, except for 2020, where I think probably, the fact that we had a lot of lockdowns and there just weren't a lot of public gatherings, large crowds, probably contributed to the fact that there were only 2 mass shootings that year. But so and then, for me, I want to try and separate, and Violence Project's not a perfect definition for that fact, because the other interesting thing about the sort of stability of the number of these events per year is that they're only counting ones where somebody actually has killed 4 or more people, right? So not somebody who has attempted to carry out that type of attack, but somebody who actually did it and managed to kill 4 or more people. So the FBI's active shooter definition in their report might be a little bit more indicative of how many people are trying to do this every year. But the weird thing about that is there doesn't seem to be any correlation really between how many people attempt it, or at least how many active shooter incidents there are per year, and how many actually end up with 4 or more killed, which is kind of wild. There didn't seem to be any correlation. If you look at like the last report of active shootings, there were more attempts in there were like double the number of attempts in 2022 than there were in 2019, but those years had about the same number of actual incidents where 4 more people were killed. And so it could be just extremely difficult to try and correlate anything here with those sorts of events, right?
Yeah, it is. And I think to your point about the gun violence archive being a little not restrictive enough, perhaps you kind of meet in the middle and you say 8 or more victims or something like that. I think that would be more telling. I think that we lose so much. There's so few shootings that are that match the Violence Project's definition that it makes it difficult, I think, to figure out what is the cause of the changings, other than 2020, which I agree is probably just nobody was outside. And so it's hard to meet the definitions that they have set up. I guess, the idea.
My bigger issue with the gun violence archive definition is not the number that they use injured instead of killed, or it's more that they don't filter the types of incidents they are. Because that's what, to me, makes it harder to use as a like useful gauge. Like I don't like it certainly is tell you something that I guess because a lot of these incidents, it's like people are shooting at there's a shootout or they're shooting at a particular target and they don't necessarily care that there's collateral damage. That's kind of what the Kansas City Super Bowl parade thing seemed to turn out to be, or probably a lot of the shootings you're describing in Louisiana would probably fit that definition of like, they're not necessarily trying to kill the bystanders. They just don't care, right? That someone else is getting injured. Whereas like a lot of the stuff that gets tracked to the Violence Project one, that's where people, that's your indiscriminate killing of large numbers of people as a, that's the purpose of what they're doing.
Sure.
Does that make any sense? Like that as far as a distinction goes there, or why I would see, my issue with the two definitions?
Yeah, I think it does. I guess for me, what I want to measure is things going up, things going down. And so it's a lot easier to do that with a less restrictive definition. So I think that's probably where my bias comes in.